I want to introduce now Bill Gaventa, my new best friend. Many of you have already heard him, and you know that both Bill and Eric, who are our keynotes this year, they're back by popular demand from last year, and we are just so thrilled to have them. So last year we started enlightening everybody on inclusion, and this year we hope that we're taking it to the next step in beyond inclusion, getting us to that place of belonging. But Bill is now a Texan. Last year he was not. And so anytime you're driving through Waco, just stop by and see him. And as we all know, he's the associate editor for the Journal of Disability and Religion, formerly the Journal of Religion, Disability, and Health. He has so many accolades, and you've gotten his bio. I don't want to take any more time away from you all actually getting to hear him. So, Bill Gaventa.
So, we okay, Drew? Beyond inclusion. Well, kind of a funny title for a conference based on beginning and strengthening inclusive ministries. Sounds somewhat like the classic Protestant and American work ethic, also mirrored in so many IEPs and individual service plans with people with disabilities. And it goes like this. You're here. We've got goals. We're going to help you get here. And as soon as you get here, well, by God, we're going to give you some more goals. And you're going to have to get here. And then you're going to have to get here. And then you're going to have to get here. And somewhere along the way, somebody's going to say, can you let me just sit for a while? You know, can you just let me sit, rest, kind of celebrate where I am? Where's the reward I was promised? And can't we celebrate? Kind of like the disciples in the New Testament in the Transfiguration story, can't we just stop here on the mountaintop and build a chalet and have some wine and enjoy the view? There are a bunch of real problems with that. One, of course, is we make an assumption that we're in the control of that process, and we never are. Nothing ever happens. Life never happens according to the way we make our plans. Second, we think that the only way to help people is through accomplishments. Kind of a big illusion. And third, it refers and illustrates another longtime Christian fallacy and struggle and tendency that we think we are saved by our works, or that a general cultural one that we have to win love and acceptance by hard work with other people. That if I don't do something, you're not going to like me, or to love me, or to celebrate who I am. So it's not that vision and those goals are bad, but those needs are preceded and need to be preceded and balanced by acceptance and celebration and love just where you are on that ladder or on that hamster wheel as you keep running and running. For all of us, can't we just be okay for who we are, or as we Baptists like to sing, just as I am, just as I am. Can't you be with me for a while without trying to fix me or help me? Just listen, for God's sake. Just listen. That was what Nancy Easland, one of the huge pioneers in the disability and theology, said. Just listen. Listen with a justice ear. Listen with a justice ear, and then we'll learn the barriers and the boundaries and the goals that need to be set and what needs to be done. But first, just listen. That's one of the stages that I talked about a year ago at the Fine Conference at Preston Hollow Presbyterian, where we often, and you all know some of this, I'm not going to go through it all, and it's in stuff that's written, and you don't have to you're going to get most of this whole talk on if you do what she has set as a goal and do the evaluation. We often start with fear and ignorance about people with disabilities that leads to exclusion, and sometimes in world history, execution. And then moved to pity, with special services and ministries to and all kinds of things for people. And then to anger, when we begin to listen to people and hear what they've gone through and the wounds that have happened and the barriers they're faced, often at the hands of the very faith communities we're trying to help include people in. And then finally to love, where we as individuals and congregations, all of us, begin to realize that I may be doing something for somebody else, or our congregation for them, but by golly, they're bringing new life to me, doing all kinds of things for me. There's no such thing here about my being the giver and they're being the receivers. It's a whole mishmash and mixed up, and we're all in that together. And then you also begin to realize it's not ministry to or for, but ministry by people who happen to have labels of one kind or another. Or as one of my favorite phrases from Johnny and Friends says, it's not a ministry with people with disabilities until people with disabilities are doing the ministering. One of the things I've learned in this last 15 months is that other people have come up with those very same kinds of things that I've talked about for years, and none of us knew each other existed. So Elam Christian Services, who have been here this week, have a wonderful kind of 5 stages of disability acceptance, or the five stages, and you'll get it when you get the paper, and they call it ignorance, pity, care, friendship, and then co-laborers. So, ignorance, pity, care, friendship, and then co-laborers. We are laboring together. About 20 years ago, I wrote a piece for the Disability Rag magazine called Believing, Belonging, Believing, trying to sum up what I thought at that point was kind of where we were in history. Believing. I had started off in the world of intellectual disabilities and what was called mental retardation in those days, dealing with lots of people who at that point thought that people with intellectual disabilities could not believe really because they didn't have the rationale or reason or intellect. That belief was a matter of reason. In fact, the whole Enlightenment connected belief with reason, and people thought for a long time that to be a believer you had to have the right kind of intellect. And if you didn't, you really didn't know what was going on. And in Christian communities, the classic way that came out was, how could we let them receive communion? How do we know they know what's going on? 2 years ago, the National Roman Catholic Church did a survey. It turned out that more than 50% of Catholics didn't know what was going on, according to what the Catholic Church wanted to go. So, and that, how do any of us know all of what that means? It's not communion and other sacraments are not totally a rational enterprise. If they were, they wouldn't be sacraments. And so the idea was, okay, then we began to say, okay, we move from that worry to how do we help people belong and get connected to communities and be connected and be parts of communities. That children need to have the experience of growing up in a faith communities, and adults need to have a chance to get reconnected, to know what it feels like to be here, to become a member, to hope you belong. This is your temple, your community, your mosque. You're one of us. You're part of our family. I recently heard a remarkable group of young adults in Portland, Oregon, at an Inclusive Ministries conference who were at transition age in their 20s, talking about what their faith communities had meant to them during transition. Now, let me ask you, how many of you have seen that on a program anywhere about the role of faith communities and faith in transition? But one of these guys was a guy who was face and tongue were what we might call severely out of the normal, in such a way that it was, until you got to know him, not an easy guy to look at. Not an easy guy to look at. He didn't talk, he couldn't talk, but he had a computer. And some of the stuff he said was just profound. And I went over, it was once again one of those experiences is just having my perceptions and expectations blown to smithereens. And after they talked, I went over and started talking to him. And we started talking back and forth, and I was saying, Sam, you've got to write your story up. People have got to hear this, and we'd love for you to help do this. And he said, one of the things he said was, you know, I really would be a man of faith if these opportunities had been open to me 20 years ago or 10 years ago. What he was saying, there was so much part of his life where he thought he was out and excluded, and I would really be a man of faith. And so believing, belonging, believing, what I began to think was, it's not about what they believe, it's about what we believe. It's about whether we believe what we think, where we put into practice the words and the values we profess. Everybody's welcome. God loves everybody. Everybody's got gifts. You're all welcome here. Do we believe that deeply and strongly enough to make that happen? It's not their belief, it's our belief. It's our belief, and do we believe that? It's our attitudes, our theologies, our models, our habits, our traditions. Elizabeth Hastings, who used to be the director of the national office in Australia on disability services, and is one of my heroes, and was a devout believer, would say that we're asking the wrong question. We need to get to a point, she would say, and I think Judith Snow would full-heartedly agree from our thing on Wednesday, that people with disabilities and their allies should not have to justify being included and belonging. The faith community should have to justify excluding them. I am part of God's community by my very creation. We say it in all kinds of ways in the Scriptures. Genesis, created in the identity of God. John, all was good. All was good. I'm sure people in the Muslim faith have the same other kinds of phrases, but we shouldn't have to do that. And in a kind of play on the wonderful book that Brian McLaren wrote, I don't know if you've read his book on what would Muhammad, Jesus, and Moses do on the road. It's a wonderful book about faith diversity, but it's one of those books that's all about disability. He just never talks about it in the book. And one of the things he would say, if we ask the question, well, what would Jesus do? What would Muhammad do? What would Moses do? I think most of us know the answer. Even though every single one of those major religious figures had a confrontation by somebody with a disability or limitation to help them help them realize, well, all means all. Each one of them did in one way or another. That had to be confronted by a person with a disability to help them realize that all means all. If you want the specifics, I'll talk to you later. The only problem, of course, about all this is also this assumption of duality. Normal, disabled, insiders, outsiders, us, them. The challenge for us as we move beyond inclusion is to figure out a language where there's not that duality, where all means all, but it's not easy given our cultural love of categories and our religious love of categories and labels, but it also means that any question or thing that comes up about disability in a faith community, that question needs to be turned around and says, this is about all of us, so how do we deal with that? I've talked in pastoral, some of you have seen some of the stuff I wrote. It took me a while to develop my own sense of what are the core pastoral care roles with people with intellectual disabilities and their families, and I came up with presence and guide, counsel, advocate, and community builder. Worked with that for a while, and I said, essentially, hell, it's a good pastoral care for anybody, in terms of way of talking about that. I spent another 5 years thinking about what was the kind of core, and thinking one day about what were core theological issues that were bubbling up out of the inclusive faith community. And you all have seen this, or I can get it to you, and wrote about things like hospitality to the stranger, and remembering the body and the sanctuary, and reversing the call, and coming to our senses and using all of our senses. You sit there and think about those for a while and say, wait a minute, those are core, profound, theological faith principles for everybody, not just for people with disabilities. It comes back around and says, this is not about them, it's about all of us. So let me play with you for a few minutes with some leadership principles that come out of with using some biblical symbols to help you get thinking about some of this, just to show that some of this is not new. It's really old by playing with some of the symbols. And again, this is going to be in your paper, and I've got it some other places, and you can welcome more in it. So the questions are some of the things. It used to be the 10 Commandments, but it's now 13. But 13. So, first one, who's around the table? As we plan and work with our community inclusion, who's in the planning? The person we're planning with or about, are they there somehow? It's the classic slogan in the disability movement, nothing about us without us. Who's around the table? How many times have you had the experience of somebody calling you and saying, how do I help this person, or what can our congregation do with this person with a disability? And I said, did you ask them? Or did you ask them? Who's around the table first? Second, reverse the question. Anytime somebody asks a question about a person with a disability, then turn that question back around and say, how do we deal with that question? How do you deal with a kid who's got bad behavior in Sunday school? What do you do with your other kids that have got bad behavior in Sunday school? What happens when somebody makes a disruption in a service? Well, is a disruption in a service first time it's happened because you had a person with a disability? I doubt it. So any kind of theological question that gets asked because of the symbolic presence and the powerful symbolic presence of disability because of something unusual in our faith communities, you've got to be very careful that person doesn't become the weather vane or the scapegoat for the fears and illusions of people who are around us. Classic question, oh my God, can they come? What about our liability? If it's the first time your church has thought about liability, then you're in problem. And you got to see that question as evidence of the risk and the anxiety that people have because this is something new. It's not a legal question. It's not a financial question. It's an emotional question, and that kind of thing. Reverse the question. Then reverse the answers. Any of the answers that you get and we get about really helping to include somebody or a kid or somebody with a disability, by golly, it's not just about them. It's something that's really good and can be good for a lot of other people. There are lots of data and stories now about how things developed in special education in special ed is where the innovation is coming that's being used for all of education. Person-centered educational plans, by golly, all of us would like a person-centered educational plan, although not all of us want to spend our life in IEPs. And you think about accessibility kinds of things. You've heard my story from the rabbi in New Jersey who said we built a new congregation that was totally accessible, and it enabled people to come who hadn't come, and it wasn't the people we expected. And one of them was the 94-year-old woman who was now finally able to come back to synagogue and hadn't been able to get into our old sanctuary. She came once a month with AIDS till she died. We had the service from there. And then we found out that she and her husband had been the ones who paid the mortgage of the synagogue during the Depression when they didn't have any money to do that. So, you just never know who's going to come. You make it accessible. It's all the moms say, oh, great, we can put our dads too, I do it, push their stroller in. I don't think we have people riding in with a bike to the sanctuary yet, but it's probably coming given the rise of bicycles in our country. So core strategies, positive behavior support, circles of support, person-centered planning, it's not about them. It'd be great for everybody else too as well. Great for everybody else. There are lots of examples. Be careful, next, with words and language. In community building, we need to be very careful with the overuse of jargon and language that comes from diagnoses, assessments, therapies, yada, yada. A good role we used to have at the center where I worked in meetings, and you could have it in anything you do with something, is to appoint somebody a jargon buster. And so their role in a committee meeting is anytime somebody uses an acronym that nobody knows or they don't know, well, what is that? What is that jargon? And there's secular jargon and there's religious jargon, on both sides of that fence. And though be also, in the midst of all that importance of language, be willing to give people some space and help them to learn without hitting them over the head for the use of wrong language. And I'll come back to that a little bit. Fifth, build a Joshua committee. A Joshua committee, the name of Judith Snow's first circle of support. The circle of support that helped her get out of a medical rehab hospital when none of the secular or health system processes worked. A Joshua committee. Think of the imagery. A Joshua committee who helps people get out of the wilderness into the promised land, across that river, across that divide, that great divide. There's stuff, all kinds of stuff about circles of support. The Mennonites have got the best little booklet about it for faith communities, and you can look that up. But a circle can say it's not going to happen, but you've got a team working with you on this. We're going to use Circle of Support in our exciting new project that Eric and Penny are involved in. You can see the poster outside, where our hunch is that a circle of people who know somebody with a disability in a congregation with the networking capacity and power of that congregation could be one of the best avenues to help people with disabilities find a job. Not through the VR, but to use connections. How many of you in this room got your job because of connections and people that you knew? So let's tap that power. Let's tap that power. You can see that outside. Develop a Jericho strategy. What do you mean by Jericho strategy? Well, you know the story about you all sang the story. What is it? What's the song? Joshua, the battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down? Okay. Now, this is, from biblical scholar standpoint, this is total eisegesis, okay? It's total eisegesis, which means I'm reading my story into that story. But that story is, at one level, about the power of persistent celebration. They didn't attack those walls. They walked around the walls with trumpets and banners and having a really good time. And this biblical passage doesn't say that the walls caved in. For all you know, the people inside could have said, we'd like to be part of that outside. We'd like to join that. Looks like they're having a really good time. So as we work on this in our inclusive congregation or initiatives and so on, make sure you celebrate and have fun, because when you do it, there's all kinds of funny and fun stuff that happens in this. And until people get over the sense that being with the people with disabilities is somehow tragic, because there's not, they've got some of the best humor in the world. Have fun doing it, because after a while, people in your congregation are going to say, I would like to be in on that. And we need to get more of that out into the wider congregation. So Jericho strategy, celebrate what you're doing and celebrate every good thing, every little thing that happens. And use humor and claim humor. We get so wrapped up in this, and there are people with disabilities who are great comedians. If you want some access to some of that, I can let you know more about where some of those are. But there are funny things that happen. And it's a whole big difference between laughing at somebody and laughing with somebody, and having people laugh, and where I can laugh at me, and the person with disability can laugh with me at me too, or with me, and vice versa. So, power of persistent celebration. Use a fish and loaves approach to community building. There were 5,000 people to be fed. The disciples' first response, mostly like our human service system, where can we refer them for supper? Where can we send them for supper? Or we don't have it. We can't do it. To whom we'll refer them. What did Jesus say? You do it. What did the disciples say? Classic human service, sometimes church response. We don't have the money. Can you give me a grant? And then we'll do it. Can you give me a grant? And then we'll do it. And by golly, then we could really do it. And what did Jesus say? You do it. And there are a couple of different versions of the story. A little bit of eisegesis here again. But in one of them, they separated the group into companies of 50. They broke up those hordes, maybe into circles where people had to look at each other's eyes rather than at the leader who was expected to do everything. It's kind of like being director of the Summer Institute sometimes. But get a look at people's eyes, and then this little kid pulls out, this little person pulls out this little gift and says, here. And says, here. That's partly the, doesn't mean what size that gift is. This little kid pulls out that gift. Everybody's got gifts. Can we be encouraged to use them and to offer them at whatever? And however you read the story, that Jesus did some kind of Panera bread miracle and all of a sudden there was plenty of bread, or that little kid's initiative shamed everybody else who was there, and they all brought their picnic lunch out from under their robes and started sharing like any good church or synagogue or mosque night supper, and by golly, everybody got fed. Whatever way it was a miracle, because it got everybody to contribute, and everybody was filled. So fish and loaves, it's you do it. There's abundance here if we ask everybody and include everybody's gifts in the doing of that. And then what follows is the believing in the possibility of call, that they, meaning typical folks, once they get to know somebody, know them, may change in ways that give people new visions, new values, a new sense of purpose, and a deeper faith. Getting to know you is the key. I'm not going to sing it. Getting to know you. Not about you, but getting to know you. People with disabilities were once unknown to many people. Like the title of the little booklet on your table, we don't have any here. Were once unknown. But there's this scholar called Eric Carter who has these wonderful slides that use Google Earth to take a picture, say, overhead of the Highland Park neighborhood. And you're going to do that? It's coming? I won't say any more then. Tell you something about how many people with disabilities are within a radius of this congregation or any congregation in the Dallas areas. So if they're unseen, how do we get to know them? Many people are unseen behind program walls and nursing homes and group home walls, and behind psychological walls that say we dare not show any fault or limitation to the outside world. That's not an issue in Park Cities, is it? That we dare not show a weakness or a limitation to the outside world? It is in Waco. It was in New Jersey. But Texans maybe are different. I don't know yet. But if people really feel welcomed, and other people will begin to notice and to know people. And it may be a while before somebody gets introduced in the congregation to the person who's coming, but the other people will know that they're there, and many people will rejoice in the fact that our congregation is doing something, but I'm not brave enough yet to go introduce myself to that person. So that's part of our role. And it may be a while, but we're trained to do, because when you know that we typical folks, whatever that means, are trained by our upbringing without thinking about it, that our eyes can pick out somebody who doesn't fit the mold without our even thinking about it. In a mall, wherever, something else, that's just there. It's just there. And it's especially there when you got a group of people from a group home going down the mall strip or going somewhere when it's a kind of group and things like that. We are trained, it's part of the hidden curriculum of our culture. It's the hidden curriculum of our culture. And when people start to come, can we get to make sure that people get to know them by name? Our friend and way too soon departed friend Nella Oitvelik of Friendship Ministries used to say, when she'd do workshops and someone said to her, oh, we've got 10 people who've been to come in from 2 group homes for weeks now to our congregation. So he asked, and as if that was a mark of pride. And she said, do you know their name? Do you know their name? I like to go to a place where everybody knows my name. As the as John Dunn, the Assistant Attorney General, at the signing of the ADA, wrote this wonderful essay that said, it shouldn't be easier for people to get into a bar than to a church. And the paradox about that all is that most of us, Robert Raines, a clergyman, had this wonderful quote that said, we all think we want to be well known. Now, people with disabilities get to be noticed, and they may be widely noticed, but they won't be well known. But Robert Raines says, we all think we want to be well known, famous, etc., but what we really want is to be known well. What all of us deeply yearn for is to be known well. A lot of so-called typical folks who come to a church on Sunday morning or a synagogue or a temple wishing that others and the pastor and others knew what was going on in the depth of their lives, but of course they haven't told anybody. It's one of the dilemmas and the hazards of the pastoral care role, because somebody would say, you didn't come to visit me in the hospital, and the pastor will say, nobody told me. Well, didn't God tell you? It's like, how do we make known the kind of needs and the kinds of supports that are there? We all want to be known well. We all want people to know our story. Not my condition, not my problem, not my limits, but Stan talked about it yesterday. We all want people to know our story. And when you give people with disabilities and family members in the faith communities the opportunity to tell their story, I guarantee you that every one of those stories preaches in one way or the other, either for good or for bad, and then we begin to get to know people. There's an African proverb that says, an enemy or a stranger, we could say, is someone whose story I don't know. Whose story I don't know. Because once you know somebody's story, it's really hard to keep up the same illusions or stereotypes that we once had about that. And the problem with that is, as Parker Palmer would say, when we know somebody's story or somebody's truth, then there's no telling what that's going to call us to do, call us to respond. And that's the resistance. What will keep us, that sense of, if I get to know them, what am I going to be called upon to do? How is my life potentially going to be changed? And I'm not sure I want that change yet. Ninth, what's most important is invisible to the eye. The fox said to the little prince, whatever you think about programs and names and buildings and et cetera, it's relationship, it's relationship, it's relationship. That's the key. Relationship, relationship, relationship. Build relationships any way you can. 10, watch out for the idolatry of ideology, both on the religious side and the secular side. You don't think the faith that secular systems and advocacy groups have dogma? Well, you got to live in that world for a while. You don't think congregations do? We all know that. Watch out for the idolatry of ideology, of ideals of things being perfect, that criticizes other things. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, as they say, or that small concrete steps towards the goal are sure a lot better than being paralyzed by not being able to do it perfect from the get-go. Don't let the ideology be the idolatry. 11th, just because everybody's welcome doesn't mean anything goes. It means that Fred Craddock said this, every congregation's got a culture, and every congregation's full of unspoken rules and a hidden curriculum, as the autism world says. Most of us absorb it by growing up. Some of us had years of practice of that, and some of those years during teenagerhood and young adulthood, some of us might have called torture. Do I have to do that again, Mom? Do we have to keep on going? You learn it till you do it over again until you get it. But those rules. Tom Reynolds, who's one of our faculty who wasn't here this year, has this wonderful phrase that says, can we learn to interpret provocation, a la behavior, or something that challenges us? Can we see provocation as invocation? That provocation is really an invitation for us to do something different. because what's going on right now is not working. And it's classic positive behavior supports. Behavior is communication, what's being communicated, and how can we, one, help a person learn a different behavior positively rather than discipline, good, bad. But then secondly, how do we maybe have to adjust our norms or help people learn what's really there in the hidden rules so we can adjust as well. People want to belong and want to be accepted. If you work with them well and give them the right kind of kind, good feedback or work on that and say, there are things here we got to do for all of us to be accepted, people will learn. It's about helping learn norms while also changing the norms. You got to meet in both ways about that. It's like the synagogue who started, and sometimes that means starting a new kind of worship service like parables, like Leslie's done over here, or like, as Shelley and I were talking, there's a synagogue who started a no-shh service. No-shh service. And one of the things I've become deeply aware of at this Summer Institute is the number of parents and people who have felt by those negative experiences in typical congregations and have felt so shamed at times because of behavioral issues. It's not just a question of meeting the culture, it's a question of being shamed. It's a question of being shamed. It goes back to a Greek Orthodox mom who said to me once she walked into the Greek Orthodox Church in New York with her daughter with cerebral palsy, and somebody who was sitting on the side of the pew, and I guess this is a Greek thing or a kind of symbol, but the person raised the flap of her coat and went, it was like this gesture of unclean, you don't belong here. Think about that. Think about that. Okay, broaden your capacity to deal with paradox. It's not either or. It's got to hold things both and at the same time. Both and at the same time. And a few years ago, I've worked a lot in cultural competence and diversity in New Jersey, and then yesterday, as some of you know, I sort of tried to say, how do cultural competence issues, diversity, disability, and different religion issues, they all come together? And at one conference we had during the course of the day, all of a sudden some things came to me about all of this. And let me it's kind of a little poem, and let me, some of this dealing with paradox. To heal, assess what helps people stay well. To have people come to you, you've got to go to them. To help others, people's grow, start with yourself. To learn, listen. To teach, let yourself be taught. To help, empower others to do it. To lead, hand over the reins. To accomplish your mission, help other people accomplish theirs. To get somewhere with others, walk beside them. To collaborate, ask for help. To give, be willing to be received. To be an expert, know what you don't know, and be willing to say so. And to be competent, practice humility. There's a new form of story emerging. The story goes like this. I've heard it from congregations who said, we have been working on inclusive ministries. People are coming. People are becoming members. And what's happening is it's transforming our congregation in terms of both spirit and numbers. So if you want to appeal to the church growth value or synagogue growth value, and you think about the numbers of folks with disabilities who feel excluded, or quote, as the Protestants like to say, unchurched, boy, there are a lot of people, we think they're not interested. There are a lot of people out there who would like to be part of it if we'd be willing to listen and help folks in. A parent once told me, we moved to a new town, and started church shopping. We took our daughter one day to a church, expecting that we'd have to be the advocate and do these things, kind of push things. We came in, somebody came over and said, who are you? Glad to have you. Your daughter, could you tell us about your daughter? And within 5 minutes, they had a teen buddy who had been pre-trained and do work to go with the daughter to the inclusive religious education class, and the parents were faced with the dilemma, now what in God's name do we do? It's just a pure experience of grace, of expecting to come in to have to battle and to fight, and all of a sudden, you're here, you're welcome, you're part of us. And our daughter looks like she's having a lot more fun without us. So, what happens when we all belong? It means giving, receiving, supporting, learning. It means The great paradox of ministry, as Henry Nouwen said, is that we minister above all with our weakness, a weakness that invites us to receive from those to whom we go. The more in touch we are with our own need for healing and salvation, the more open we are in gratitude for what others have to offer us. The true skill of ministry is to help fearful and oppressed people, men and women, become aware of their own gifts and then receive them in gratitude. In a sense, ministry becomes the skill of not active doing, but of active dependency. The skill of active dependency, being willing to depend upon what others have to give, but don't realize they have. And then, what happens when everybody belongs at that point? Well, who knows? Maybe God does. I think God would be pretty excited about it in whatever form we talk about it. And then we could learn and grow together, love those around us, stay connected in the community, welcome other people. Then we can grow together. Dan Elsher, the executive director of the Association for Theological Schools, told me a great story last fall at the AARSBL meeting. We were having breakfast, and he said he'd gone to preach at a friend's church in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and this church has been welcoming and inclusive for a long time with all kinds of ministries, including starting and keeping connected to the church a couple of group residential programs, which is back to the future, because there were a lot of cathedrals in the Middle Ages that had hostels connected to cathedrals where people cared for people. And Dan walked into the service that morning and saw a congregation that was just full of diversity and people with all kinds of abilities. And he said, his thought was, well, by golly, the body of Christ finally showed up. Or you could say the whole people of God finally showed up. A few years, 20, 30 years ago, the United Methodists put out that little booklet that's on your table. We don't have any here. And if you're sitting there wondering who gave us this booklet that uses the words mental retardation in it, it's me. I've had a pack of them I'm a pack rat, and they gave all the leftovers to me, and I've been using them. We don't have any here. But here's where we might be going. We don't have any here. Oh, we're doing all this work on inclusion, and people are beginning to get to belong. And then somebody's going to come, and I've heard this happen too, where somebody says, what do you do with people with disabilities in your congregation? And the conversation goes like this: what do you do? We don't have any here. That's kind of hard to believe. Expert researcher Eric Carter says you have to have some here, or right around here, just by sheer statistics. And I went to a conference where he talked about that. So it's got to be gospel. I'm not sure what you mean. Tell me. Well, people with autism, or people with Alzheimer's or strokes who may not come, or people with mental illness, people who use a wheelchair. Well, I saw a couple people like that when I visited your congregation last week, the other day. And the guy sat over there on the right-hand side, and the young woman with Down syndrome who was an usher, and the person in the congregation says, oh, you mean Bill? What a cool guy. He's got the greatest stories, and kids love to listen to him talk. And yeah, Joan, she's one of the best ushers we have. People, they come back because of her. Yeah, but they're just Bill and Joan. They don't have a disability. They're just Bill and Joan. They're part of us. They have gifts. We don't have any here. We have people here whose names we know. From we don't have any here to inclusion, to belong, to we don't have any here. And then who and what do we become? Well, wouldn't it be great to find out? Thank you.